On September 8, 2025, the French National Assembly will take a vote of confidence in its coalition government, or depending on the time you see this episode, it's already done that. Right now, every warning sign indicates that the government cannot survive, and what France's Prime Minister thought was a daring gamble was instead an act of political self-destruction. It's not the first time France's government has collapsed, and in fact, it's not even the first time this year. Hell, it's not even the second time, and by now it's become clear that when the French government of the 2020s collapses, it doesn't just take a little tumble, it throws itself at the ground, full force, and almost seems to like it. So why does France's government keep on collapsing? Better yet, why does France keep on building governments that seem as if they can't help but collapse? What does the collapse of this government mean for the nation, and who is it even helping when France decides to engage in this exercise over and over again? And most important of all, even if the French government does survive this vote, who's to say that it won't just collapse again next month or next week or even by the time this episode is over? This is the chaos, the nonsense, and the utter masochism of France's political system and the fall of a national government that will almost certainly disappear within one day's time. Okay, first up, let's establish what we're actually talking about. What does it actually mean to say that the French government is going to collapse? While anything is possible in global politics, we can say with some certainty, knock wood, that the following things are probably not going to happen. Emmanuel Macron is not going to be dragged kicking and screaming from the Elysee. He's still France's president until the scheduled end of his term in May 2027. Nor is the collapse of a French government going to bring about the advent of the Sixth Republic, nor will it elevate far-right leader Marine Le Pen to a dominant position within French politics. There will be no storming of the Bastille and no popular revolution by croissant-throwing chain smokers. Again, knock on wood. Instead, the collapse of the French government is an entirely procedural affair, although it can be dramatic in its own way. France, of course, uses a parliamentary system in which various political parties send their representatives to the National Assembly. The most powerful party works unilaterally if it has a majority of seats, and if they don't, then they've got to cobble together a coalition government with the help of smaller political parties. For the benefit of Americans who are watching today, this is how legislatures work when you're not locked into an eternal two-party system. In the event that the party leading the coalition fails to make its coalition members happy, fails to govern the nation properly, or otherwise finds itself doing a bit of a job, then it runs the risk of facing a confidence vote. If that happens, then the entire National Assembly gets to vote on whether the current coalition is doing so terribly that they've got to be thrown out of the job. That doesn't mean that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet have to quit government altogether, but instead that they're forced to resign from their roles as ministers and go back to being regular parliamentarians. The government remains open, and often the disgraced politicians in question will continue to serve as caretakers until a replacement can be chosen. All the while, the nation's president has to cobble together a new government by creating a version of a ruling coalition that hopefully can combine forces to hold a majority. Right now, that ruling coalition is led by one Francois Bayrou, leader of a party known as the European Democrats for over 20 years and appointed to the role of Prime Minister in December of last year. Bayrou's tenure hasn't exactly been straightforward, as we will explain later in today's episode, but the crisis that has brought France's government to the brink of collapse can be neatly summed up in a single four-letter word: debt. France has taken on quite a bit of debt in recent years, and in fact, it hasn't balanced its national budget since 1974, creating a financial situation that has placed France, according to Bayrou himself, quote, on the brink of over-indebtedness. As The Economist points out, Bayrou really does have reason to be concerned. It's running the highest deficit in the entire Eurozone relative to GDP, and while there are plenty of entities willing to lend France their money, they're also willing to insist on some formidable interest rates in the process. According to France's finance minister, France could even need a bailout from the International Monetary Fund if things keep getting worse. But Bayrou's proposed solution, a slash to government spending, is about as unpopular as a political proposal can get. Right now, France's National Assembly is split into three parts: a populist far right, a populist far left, and the centrist wing that actually governs the nation through Bayrou and his cabinet. In order to get a budget passed, Bayrou needs the support of either the far right or the far left. But for both of them, voting to support Bayrou's spending cuts would be an obvious political misstep. After all, Bayrou doesn't even have a majority government. If he wants to pass a budget, he can work politely with the far left or the far right, respectively, and pass a budget that they'd approve of. And frankly, there is no way that they'd give approval for the measures that Bayrou has in mind. Although it's not the biggest implication of the budget in the long term, Bayrou's plan would eliminate 2 national holidays, the sort of thing that no populist in their right mind could ever politically justify. Now, to be clear, this didn't have to be an existential crisis. If the French government can't pass a budget for an upcoming year, it could just roll over the budget that it used for the previous year. There's no government shutdown required, and that decision could be reversed again as needed if a better proposal or a better political situation comes along. Bayrou, however, shocked the nation of France in late August when he decided to engage in one hell of a political gamble. Bayrou demanded a vote of confidence from the National Assembly to cast judgment on his government and on himself to, quote, choose between chaos or responsibility. The gambit was a simple one. Vote to collapse Bayrou's government, and the economic problems will only get worse, investors and citizens will panic, and the country will start down the path to financial meltdown. But keep Bayrou in office, and opposition parliamentarians are essentially voting in endorsement of his plan. There's no way to keep him around and agree that he's a legitimate leader without also keeping the plan that defines his approach to governance. In some ways, Bayrou even had decent justification to believe that the opposition would fold. His government has survived prior confidence votes in the last few months, lobbed occasionally at him from the left wing of French politics, but not supported by the political right. The gamble, however, would turn out to fail in the most spectacular fashion possible. No sooner had Bayrou announced the confidence vote, stunning even his own political party in the process, than the opposition had made clear that they intended to vote him out of his position. This time, both the National Rally on the right and the Socialist and Green parties on the left indicated that they had no interest in rescuing Bayrou from the trap that he'd created for himself. Bayrou could afford, either for the left or the right, to vote against him, but victory is impossible if he loses both, as he now appears to have done. Very quickly, the media, the markets, and the French political world came to the same conclusion. François Bayrou had overplayed his hand, and a collapse of his government was imminent. Bayrou stuck his course even after it became clear that the populist parties were against him. But at least at the time of writing, he appears destined to go down with the ship. Now, as we mentioned, this isn't the first or even the second collapse of the French government in recent memory, but all things considered, it's still a relatively new problem for Paris. Prior to 2024, the last time that a French government had fallen apart in a no-confidence vote was over 60 years ago, and for most of the intervening time, it's been all but unthinkable that such a thing would happen. At least within the halls of the National Assembly, it's fairly uncommon for modern French politics to involve such turmoil, although the French public's love for strikes and marches is a different story entirely. But the situation in France changed dramatically in July of last year, when, in an act that's becoming a theme for this episode, a powerful French politician took a gamble and failed. This time, it was President Macron who had dissolved the National Assembly and called for a snap election after the far-right opposition party, the National Rally, made major gains in a separate election for the European Parliament at the expense of Macron's own party. Macron's goal was to seize on what he hoped was a bit of buyer's remorse from the public, who might have seen their decision to elect a large right-wing nationalist contingent to the European Parliament, gotten a pit in their stomachs, and agreed to vote the opposite way. It was, however, a pretty massive gamble, considering that French voters had just delivered the National Rally a major win, and in an outcome that quite a few of Macron's critics saw coming, the gamble failed spectacularly. The National Rally surged to capture a third of the first-round vote, and a collection of left-wing parties took second place, leaving Macron's own political coalition stuck in third. When the election went to a runoff, the National Rally didn't win outright. Macron ended up with a hung parliament where no political party or coalition had captured enough support to govern outright. Macron refused to endorse a PM from either the far right or the far left, meaning that any remaining path would require him to find a political leader who was at least palatable for everyone, even if that leader was beloved by practically nobody. Macron would cobble together a rather underwhelming government in the aftermath, led by a compromise candidate named Michel Barnier. That government, however, was not long for this world. It would ultimately last one day less than 3 months before being toppled in a crushing no-confidence vote that made it the shortest-lived government since the founding of the French Fifth Republic. But even though that saga is a difficult one for Macron, the next government would be just a little bit worse. This time, Macron wasn't able to muster the political goodwill to choose the prime minister that he wanted, or even to fight for an option that he could tolerate. Instead, after a process that reportedly involved a shouting match between himself and Macron, France's current PM, François Bayrou, was able to strong-arm the president into appointing him as PM. Reportedly, that decision was made under threat that he would otherwise pull his party's political support and render a Macron government all but impossible to create. Bayrou was, and still is, ultimately a Macron loyalist, but he was far from Macron's first choice for the role. After Bayrou was appointed, he cobbled together his own minority government. By that time, taking pot shots at France's PM had become a political blood sport. Bayrou was the fourth prime minister to lead France in less than a year, and Macron was barred from calling another snap election to reset the National Assembly's political balance, since French presidents have to wait a year between each snap election attempt. So, Bayrou and Macron could do little to stop the left wing from calling for confidence votes whenever they felt like it, always with the risk that the National Rally would join in. Ultimately, they never did, until this most recent confidence vote that Bayrou had called for by himself. But again and again, it was the question of national finances that incensed the populist left, as well as an attempt to change the way the French electoral system works. So, by the time that Bayrou made his ultimate gamble, the current National Assembly was well accustomed to the idea that right now, confidence votes are just a fixture of French politics, with an opposition so powerful that it could form a majority if it ever united, but so ideologically split that such an outcome is all but impossible. It's the technocratic, centrist government in the middle that's become a punching bag. It's advantageous for both of the more partisan wings of French politics to take part in pushing the centrist government around. After all, whichever side is doing the pushing is typically scoring points with their voter base, while the side that remains is the side that the government has to make concessions with in order to get anything done. But after the far right and the far left created such an effective little pendulum for themselves to swing back and forth on, it's all the more significant that both are willing to throw away that convenience arrangement in order to ensure that Bayrou's new budget never becomes law. Barring what would be an incredible reversal of fortune, the government of France will fall tomorrow after a special session that will begin with a speech by Bayrou, then move into debate, and then finish with the vote of confidence. With 577 votes available, the no-confidence side needs 289 votes to succeed, a threshold they are entirely likely to reach if every party keeps to its stated position. From there, Bayrou and all of his ministers will submit their resignations, at which time they'll shift into a caretaker role, barred from making any major decisions or proposing any changes or additions to the law, while Emmanuel Macron and his allies go about finding a successor. There is, of course, an outside possibility that Bayrou and his government survive the vote, in which case they would most likely push for a vote on his budget bill as soon as possible. Even in the event that this happens, it's important to understand that just because Bayrou doesn't get thrown out of government, that doesn't necessarily mean that his budget will pass. Bayrou is making two gambles here, not just one. He's gambling that the opposition will choose to endorse his government, but he's also gambling that they'll accept his premise that a vote not to topple Bayrou and his ministers is also a vote in endorsement of the budget that he'd like to pass. Frankly, the idea that all his rival parliamentarians would honor that principle might be even harder to believe than the idea that they'd keep Bayrou in power. Any opposition party that does vote to keep Bayrou in place will then have immense leverage to either change the budget so completely that they could endorse it, or otherwise to tank the bill regardless of whatever deal Bayrou thinks that they've agreed to. If the more likely outcome plays itself out, and Bayrou and his ministers are out of a job by Tuesday morning, then Emmanuel Macron will have some choices to make. As we mentioned, Macron has to wait a year between snap elections, which is why he's been unable to do much about his political situation until now. But the one-year prohibition on a new snap election ended in July, meaning that if Macron wants to, he can call new parliamentary elections in short order. But even for a political administration that's been defined over the last year by its willingness to gamble against fate, the decision to hold a snap election now is a really tricky one. According to a series of polls a couple of months ago, the National Rally is polling even better today than they were during last year's elections, currently sitting at around 32 to 35% support nationwide. The largest left-wing party is holding steady at around 20%. Macron's party consistently places third, with as little as 15% of the national vote as opposed to the 21% that they received in the first round vote in 2024. Worst of all, those were statistics gathered before yet another Macron-backed government proved it was unable to govern, this time in an act of apparent political suicide. Gamble with a snap election right now, and Macron is likely to end up in an even worse position than he has right now. That's not to say that the decision would be unpopular. One recent poll found 63% of French respondents were in favor of dissolving the National Assembly outright. But as popular as the idea might be with the French public, the outcome would probably be highly unpopular with the nation's president. Barring that, it'll be up to Macron to choose a potential replacement. There are a few political options to consider, including a short list of names that Macron was weighing against each other just a few months ago before Bayrou forced his hand and essentially made himself PM. Those options included former Prime Minister Bernard Cazeneuve, who resigned from his role as PM when Macron was first elected in 2017, but was widely regarded as the most likely candidate to become the new PM before Michel Barnier got in that role of the prior government, which couldn't make it 3 months. There's also Sébastien Lecornu, who's been Minister of the Armed Forces through the tenures of no fewer than 4 prime ministers in a row, and François Villeroy de Gahaut, who's led the Bank of France since 2015. There are a few other names that political observers would expect to be on the shortlist, including a couple of options who would quite clearly be technocrats, largely apolitical professionals who could put together a government of experts in hopes that everybody across France's political divide will be able to grit their teeth and accept a group of responsible stewards instead of a more politically compelling option. But no matter who Macron ultimately chooses, they'll have the threat of yet another government collapse hanging over their heads, with Macron looking weaker than ever, and neither the left nor the right in a particularly cooperative mood. And just as salient as the threat of another no-confidence vote is the threat of the financial cataclysm that François Bayrou is trying hard to avoid. We've got to be clear. The economic apocalypse that Bayrou is predicting can become real if France plays its hand poorly. If that happens, it'll constitute the failure of one of the most powerful economies of the Eurozone and indeed the world. That crisis will only grow worse if the Bayrou government collapses. Faith in the French economy and its stewardship will be absolutely shaken. Stock prices will tumble, and it'll get more difficult for France to take on additional debt, which it absolutely shouldn't be doing right now. Worst of all, if the Bayrou government falls, then its painful but necessary budget bill is going to be thrown out by default. It could be rebuilt, or some approximation of it could be taken up by a replacement government. But it's become politically radioactive, and it is unlikely that a new government could go near it without risking yet another collapse. There are only so many times that France can play that game without suffering more ramifications, and arguably, the number of government collapses that France can afford to endure may have already gone down to 0 before tomorrow's vote. So why do French governments keep collapsing? Well, because France is in trouble. The nation's leadership is politically weak and getting weaker, offering milk toast or even painful economic stewardship at a moment when the nation is eager to go in a new direction. The nation's government lacks the ability to support itself. It's beholden to the whims of the far left and the far right, and quite frankly, it's not helping its own case with gambits like this one. Paris is staring down the barrel of a financial crisis without the right combination of leaders who are both willing and able to take it on. France's governments keep collapsing because they are a reflection of a larger situation that's become untenable. What that means for France, for Macron, for Europe, and for the world, we're going to find out tomorrow. Thanks for watching.